Good evening. Welcome to DCRIT and welcome to the School of Visual Arts. Great to see you. I'm Alice Twemlow, the chair of the programme. And you have joined our Tuesday evening lecture series, midway through, actually. We do this lecture series to complement the students' curriculum, to kind of bring in different voices, challenge in some ways what they're being presented in classes. The idea is that the students get to ask questions in a public setting, and also the other aim of this series is to kind of develop a real hub here for a discussion around design criticism. That's why it's open to members of the public, and we really enjoy your participation. Following the lecture, we have drinks and snacks in the other room. You're all warmly invited to that. And we'll also be selling some books tonight. If you want to find out more information about the programme, you are very welcome to visit our website. That is the URL and our Twitter handle. And while you're on our website, browsing our list of faculty and classes, your eye will alight on a curious-looking class called Reading Design. Here, DCRIT students develop their writerly voices and their readerly ears. They get to compose odes to objects and write personal essays about themes such as privacy, comfort, and security, inspired by Joan Didion, Annie Dillard, and Walter Benjamin, amongst many others. They also get to write environmental autobiographies, inspired by Samuel Johnson and Wendell Berry. They get to explore the ways in which design plays a starring role, both in daily news stories and in timeless literary works, such as Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and Rousseau's The Reveries of a Solitary Walker. They learn how writers, wielding their rich language, have invoked objects to access such unobject-like and intangible themes as space, time, and causality. How objects might be considered as, in Sherry Turkle's words, companions to our emotional lives, or as provocations to thought. Now, who would be suitably equipped or fitted to teach such a class? I wonder. Akiko Busch, of course. Now, Akiko Busch was a contributing editor at Metropolis Magazine for 20 years, and her essays have appeared in numerous national magazines, newspapers, and exhibition catalogues. Currently, she's a regular contributor to nextavenue.org, which is a recently launched PBS website. And here, you can see some of her most recent books: The Geography of Home, Writings on Where We Live, The Uncommon Life of Common Objects, Essays on Design and the Everyday, Patience, Taking Time in an Age of Acceleration, 9 Ways to Cross a River, and her most recent title, The Incidental Steward, Reflections on Citizen Science, published earlier this year by Yale University Press. Surveying this array, I'm really struck by the seemingly effortless ease with which she moves from a consideration of nature to design and back again, transgressing a divide which I think still holds very fast for most specialists in the natural world on the one hand and in urban and product design on the other. By transplanting concepts from one discipline to the other and through identifying the indistinct edges between these two zones, Akiko Busch finds points of confluence between the natural and the design environment that kind of allow for this amazing contemplation that is both humanistic and ecologically driven. And in doing so, I think she makes a really important contribution to the dismantling of this artificial divide between the natural and the design environments. So, as regular members of this lecture, visitors to this lecture series know, I only reserve one spot on the lecture list per season for a DCRIT faculty member. And this season, that perhaps dubious honour goes to the most lyrical, wise, and observant glass eel counter I know, Akiko Busch.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was really lovely. That was really wonderful. this is such a wonderful lecture series, and I'm really honored and humbled to be here because I know what kinds of other speakers you've had. So thank you so much, Alice, for inviting me, and thank you to Emily and Victor for their help. It's really just such a pleasure to be doing this. I came out with a book. I came out with a book last spring that had to do with landscape and stewardship. So I want to talk a little bit about how that came into being, and then I want to read a short passage from that book. The water weeds you see here, along with, these are water chestnuts that are choking areas of the Hudson River. And these, along with the bats and the eagles and the herring and the eels and all these other kind of field studies I went out on. None of these, all these things that I was thinking about when I did this book were not the kinds of things that I was thinking about all those years that I wrote more directly and more explicitly about the design world, about the designed world. So I want to talk a little bit about how I got from there to here, and because there is basically a pretty linear progression. There is a kind of sequence that makes sense. And I think if I wanted to go over that because I think if you're thinking about design or thinking about writing about design, there's a certain logic there that might be helpful. Much of my early work, I was writing in my interest in design early on. I looked at the way human beings form emotional relationships with inanimate things, whether it's a phone or a laptop or a chair or a building, and how these things have the capacity to become accessories in our emotional lives. And I found that the essay form was the form most suited to these investigations. So what I tried to do in my first book, Geography of Home, was I was interested in privacy and comfort and security. I live in a house that's over 200 years old, so I was interested in how these values are reflected in the places we live and how rooms change function and change meaning over the decades. And also attitudes about society and nature and community, how the places we live reflect all of these values. So that's what I did. That's what I did in that book. In the second book, The Uncommon Life of Common Objects, I looked at things, strollers, cameras, refrigerator, vegetable peelers, just the inanimate things that we kind of build relationships with, and how these inanimate things really are able to become full partners in human experience. And so as I became more and more engaged with these questions, I began to come up with my own definition of design. And anyone who's ever taken a class with me here knows what it is, but bear with me, which is that design has to do with a sense of fit, how a spoon fits the hand, how a body fits into a chair, how a room fits a building, how a building fits into the landscape. That was where my interest in design was, is how things find this sense of fit or how they don't. These considerations all entered a larger universe in the summer of 2001 when I took a morning swim across the Hudson River. I'd grown up in the Hudson Valley, and I live there now, and I knew that all I wanted to do was take a swim across the Hudson River. I was approaching my own half-century mark. My kids were about to be teenagers. A close friend of mine had died, and I felt as though I wanted to find a divide that could be crossed. So swimming across the river seemed to be a way to do that. It had nothing to do with books or writing, or none of that was going on at all. But what I found was that it was such a restorative and such a sustaining experience, and the Hudson River had such a particular taste and texture and feel that it made me want to go swim across other American rivers, which I did with my friend Ani, who's here tonight. And so we went to a series of different American rivers, the Connecticut, the Delaware, the Monongahela, the Cheat, the Mississippi, and swam across these rivers. And what we found, it became a kind of preoccupation, and then it became a kind of passion. But what I found 4 summers and 9 rivers later is that the divide I wanted to cross was not simply a personal. It wasn't simply personal. Certainly, that was part of it. But traveling to these rivers and swimming across them immersed me in these rivers and inevitably in the stories of restoration that these river communities around the country were experiencing. Some 35 years after the passage of the Clean Water Act, many of these river communities were experiencing the same sense of restoration that we were feeling just in swimming across those rivers. And so I came to understand that, I came to sort of see how a river could really be an agent of change. Doesn't sound like much of a stretch, but it kind of took a while to get there. Not simply in terms of economic revival, but just in terms of the communities there and how the people, who live in those neighborhoods, how the river was just kind of how a clean river was just kind of bringing this new energy to the places they lived. So this is how Nine Ways to Cross the River came into being. It didn't begin as a book. It began as a swim one summer morning across the river. And this is something also that, that I like to talk to my students about, which is that these things that don't start as books, they start as something else. They start in some other area of human experience, some other part of your life, and then you see that what you thought was perhaps a small personal story actually does connect to a broader landscape and actually does become something a little bit bigger. So that's when this became a book. My most recent book, The Incidental Steward, also began as an outing into the natural world when an intern from the DEC came and knocked on our door. Quite literally, it began as a knock on the door, right? You always say, listen to the knock, but this was literally a knock on the door. And he wanted to get our permission to go into the woods up behind our house. I live in the Hudson Valley, and he had been radio tracking an Indiana bat that was apparently roosting in the trees in the woods up behind our house, and he wanted to get our permission to go and see if he could find it. The bats had apparently been relocating after their hibernation in the winter, and they were relocating north, so scientists wanted to learn something more about these relocation habits and find out, if they could begin to learn, whether it might have anything to do with climate change or whatever. They just wanted to find out more about it. So, I said, yes, of course, you can go up there, but you have to let me come with you. So, and he was nice enough to let me do that. So, again, it didn't begin as a book. It just began as, wanting to go up and see what was happening up there. The radio signal found the bat, but it wasn't that we saw the bat, but that we heard it. If you stood very, very quietly in the woods that May afternoon, the bats were roosting under the bark of an old locust tree. And you couldn't see them, but if you listened very, very carefully, you could hear this kind of distant universe of sound, this distant kind of very soft, faint clicking that indeed signified that these bats had taken up, was the maternal habitat for this colony of bats. And so it was interesting, I thought I was going up into the woods, trying to see something, and as I discovered what I was actually doing was trying to listen to something. So I began to understand that there was this kind of manner of observation that I was not very skilled in, and I wanted to learn how to become more attentive to that. Americans, it's been said, can recognize over 1,000 logos, but can only recognize 10 plants. Yeah, I don't know where that fact came from, but it sounds really true, and it sounds, so I had to use that. I know, bad research, but anyway, there it is. And so it occurred to me that, we have this choice in what we decide to pay attention to and what we decide to notice and what we decide to recognize. So again, just in the same way that those rivers, one river led to another and to another, looking for this bat led to other projects in the Hudson Valley. It led to, counting eels and looking for herring and going off on this bald eagle census count and looking at invasive plants and, all of these kinds of things that required paying attention and documenting and recording the minutiae of the changing landscape. I don't think leaves and weeds and plants and bats all call for our attention with quite the same insistence that consumer products do. But I think they're still asking to be noticed. And I think the issues, there are different issues of identity and branding, but I think they're interesting. So I decided I was just going to pursue that for a while. And I have to admit that all of these endeavors, the bats, the herring, the eagles, all seem to be pretty far afield from those subjects we feel that design traditionally addresses, whether it's a room or a building or a piece of furniture or an electronic device. But I want to talk about this because I don't think the themes and the issues I was encountering when I was out on these field trips really are all that distant. I think a lot of them, there are a lot of kind of shared issues and shared concerns between the material world and the natural landscape. So I want to talk about those a little bit. And I think being aware of looking at some of these issues from the perspective of the natural world can kind of bring a new energy and a new perspective to the kinds of considerations that we're all doing all the time when we're kind of thinking and talking about design. So I just want to touch on a handful of these. Okay, so the first one that I was thinking about was acceleration, right? Something we're all familiar with. We all live in a world now where everything often seems to be happening too fast. That's just the condition of our times. Hurry sickness is the name that sociologists have given to this chronic rush that so many of us live with, where you sort of have to do the next thing now. Financial market, media, entertainment, any of those things, you're always concerned with how fast things are going, which is why Mylaminate vine is a plant you could say was invented for this age. It too has hurry sickness. It's named for its maniacal growth because it can grow up to 6 inches a day, defying traditional cycles of time that we associate with the natural world. And in doing so, it disrupts not only our notions of time, but native ecologies. In our neighborhood in the Hudson Valley, it ravages stream beds. What it does is it just grows along stream beds where it's moist and strangles trees and shrubs down at ground level. And then, so you see these trees that are kind of matted with vines down below, and then they're dying, the upper branches are dying. And then the trees die, and the banks of the streams and rivers become destabilized. So, and there's obviously a whole study around invasive species, but this one was one that was really going through our neighborhood. So I was out on some community stream walks around this, and various questions come up. I mean, how do you deal with a plant that grows faster than anything you had really encountered before in the natural world? One of the biggest questions, obviously, because a vine like this has no respect for property lines, is does it have to be an individual or a collective effort? How can it possibly succeed just as a series of individual efforts? And if it is a collective effort, is it one you have to legislate, or is education enough? And if you have to legislate it, how do you do that? I mean, you can burn it, you can mow it, you can bring in biological controls, which have their own problems. But all of these questions come up, none of which at the moment have any answers. But many of these questions obviously have resonance in other areas. Rick Ostrick is a geologist who took me out to these stream beds where this vine proliferates. And in talking about it, he said, "Science is just the best available knowledge that we have at any one time." And that's the way, I couldn't believe he said that, because that's the way I've always defined poetry. So I kept finding these intersections between science and humanities over and over, and these were incredibly sustaining and made the work that much more interesting for me. Okay. I want to talk about edge habitats. In ecological parlance, an edge habitat is known as the ecotone. It's the place where two habitats merge, where species from both habitats meet, at the edge of the lake, at the edge of the woods. It's some kind of edge where different systems meet. It's a place where everything changes: soil content, moisture, vegetation, humidity, light, pollination, everything, rendering it a place of vital and complex interactions. This is a view from my office window. It's pretty boring, right? It's pretty nondescript. But it's where the woods from the mountains come down and meet our yard. And it's where the forest of locusts and oaks and maples and hickories meet the brambles and the ryegrass and the timothy. And these adjacencies nurture a great biodiversity. Stuff is always happening here. I look out the window, there are always deer, there are always squirrels, a lot of times they're wild turkey. Occasionally you'll see a coyote, occasionally a bobcat. One day earlier this last summer, I was looking out this window and this brown bear black bear, strolled out of the woods and kind of lumbered across, that grass you're looking at. So, it's this edge habitat where there's always something interesting happening, which makes it, to begin with, a really great place to work. But, it just sort of reminds you what edges are. I mean, we all know you live on the edge, you take things to the edge. But when you look at it from this perspective, you get a kind of sense of what that really means and where that really comes from. And obviously, if you're talking about, it comes into play whether you're talking about urban communities or ethnic populations, or even just the way ideas can meet and have a cross-exchange and cross-pollination. I came across this quote recently by the historian and essayist Tony Judt in the New York Review of Books, titled "The Edge People," and it was a piece about ethnic identity. And I just wanted to read it because I think he put it really nicely. He said, "I prefer the edge, the place where countries, communities, allegiances, affinities, and roots bump uncomfortably up against one another." And he called edges and margins a decidedly advantageous perch, which I thought was a really nice way to put it. Okay. This is purple loosestrife. This is a really interesting non-native plant, and my sort of learning about this and talking to scientists who were studying this was kind of an interesting exercise because it arrived here in the early 19th century as an ornamental and medicinal plant, and like so many non-native plants, it didn't have any natural enemies when it arrived on American soil. And so the plant was able to grow quickly, often crowding out native plants. And so it developed this reputation as being this sort of ruthless botanical aggressor, where it would grow in these marshlands and just, choke everything else out. So it's a really beautiful plant, but people began to really hate it. But recently, questions have been raised as to whether it really is a predatory invasion, or rather signals a tenacious adaptation to changing conditions of a warming climate, and whether we have these habitats that are already degraded through problematic drainage patterns, for example, that the loosestrife just moves in and kind of takes advantage of these systems that we've already created. So is it really a disabler, or is it simply a signal of the way we have already degraded the landscape? And there's a whole other conversation about whether our innate cultural biases are reflected in the language around plants like this, other non-native plants, when we use phrases like alien species and invasive plants. All of which is to say that I think there's a pertinent lesson here for how introductions of anything are made in the global village, and how we accept and accommodate the unfamiliar and the unknown into our lives. What was interesting also to me in all of these outings, is that there's something universal I think, in the human impulse to take measure, whether it's calculating rainfall or recording bird arrival dates or snowfall or any of those things. I think there's something in taking measure that gives us some idea of control and order. One of my favorite finds when I was doing my research was finding that aquatic geologists who are researching ice formation and melt in the northern hemisphere look to records kept by Shinto priests near Japan's Lake Suwa. For over 5 centuries, the holy men kept records of when ice on the lake formed and when it melted, because it was their feeling that when a crack appeared in the ice, that was a signal that God had put his foot there. And so the fact that geologists are using this information now was, there was something that I really loved about those different spheres of knowledge coming together. And it made me think that, there is something really innately human in this desire to take measure. And then obviously there's the question of data and metadata and how you use it. We live in a time of big data and numbers and statistical analyses, and information systems all seem to offer us this infinite variety of ways to quantify and measure the physical world. But there are questions, obviously, about how we use that data. And I mean, we know this. We know this in finance. We know this in healthcare. We know this in so many fields. But it's something I kept bumping up into when I was doing my research for this book. I mean, it made me think of the BP oil spill in 2010, right? We all saw that for, I can't remember how long it was, but maybe for about 6 weeks. There was that little image, you know, at the bottom of the TV screen. Every time you were watching the news, you could see that plume of oil at the bottom of the ocean spewing out oil. And there was no way, I mean, it took weeks for scientists to be able to tell us what exactly it was. First it was, I think, 1,000 barrels a day, then it was 2,000 barrels, no, 20, 40, it ended up being 60,000 barrels a day of oil were being released, but there was no way for them to know that. So it raises this question of you can look at something, you can see something with your own eyes and still not know what it is. And so today, I mean, anybody with the right mobile phone app can submit reliable data about you name it. I mean, many citizen science programs out there. You can, record data, everything from gray squirrels to coral reefs to rainfall to ladybugs and jellyfish and, whatever. But how do you organize and disseminate all that data? What do you do with it? And then which kind of takes you into a philosophical area of when do facts actually acquire meaning? And I kept coming across this as well. So all of these things, acceleration, incongruity, and how to assimilate the unfamiliar, what happens in edge habitats, learning how to take measure, how to organize overwhelming data sets. I think all of these endeavors are common to human experience at large now. And I think that if you're thinking about design and thinking about writing about design, taking in these perspectives can broaden that kind of thinking. And I would also suggest that all of these take us back, or at least took me back to this idea, to these considerations of fit, and about human beings search out ways to find fit with the physical world around them. And going from chairs and devices to rooms and now to the natural world just led me to consider this question of fit in a much broader landscape. So it seemed to me as though there was a kind of natural progression in what I was thinking about. All of these outings also really led me to think that to realize that there is a much greater intersection between the sciences and humanities than we generally believe. I mean, we live in a time of such specialized knowledge that we don't always think these intersections exist, but I kept encountering them. They just kept coming up very naturally without my even really looking for them. The poet Wallace Stevens once said that accuracy of observation is the equivalent of accuracy of thinking. And it's a message about paying really close attention that was not so different from the message I got from many of the scientists who I went out into the field with in the years I was working on this book. And I might add, it's a similar message to what I heard from many architects and designers in those years that I was writing more explicitly about the design world. So let me just repeat that. Accuracy of observation is the equivalent of accuracy of thinking. And I think whether you're a poet or a scientist or an architect or a designer or just an engaged human being, this is really true and something to keep in mind. The last thing I want to talk about before I read is something else I found when I was doing this research is that part of paying attention at this particular moment in history has to do with reconciling different kinds of information. And this came up all the time when I was out in the field. It was an exercise in trying to reconcile what the digital imagery or the satellite information or aerial photographs or whatever it was telling you, and then what you could see with your own eyes and just what you physically could experience yourself, which is called, in scientific parlance, ground truth. It was not a term I was familiar with, and I felt that as a writer it was such a gift to be given this phrase, ground truth. And by association, or at least for me anyway, I came also to think about, air truth and water truth, what you actually experience. And I think this kind of reconciliation is something that we're all called upon to do now, and not just if you're a scientist in the field, but all of us, trying to reconcile what the remote sensors are telling you and what you're experiencing and seeing yourself with your own eyes. It's whatever. It's the difference between what you learn on a social networking site and what you learn when you're actually meeting with someone, and how those bring different kinds of knowledge to your experience. And I think at the best of times, those two different kinds of knowledge can really mutually inform and sustain one another. Sometimes they contradict one another completely, and that happened a couple of times when I was out there. But most of the time they kind of inform each other. So that's what I think we're sort of after, right? So anyway, I want to read a short section from this book, but I just have to explain a little bit about what I'm going to be reading about. I'm going to read a short section about going out and onto the Hudson River and looking for water celery, which is what you're looking at. Water celery is a subaquatic vegetation that occupies about 6% of the river from Haverstraw Bay to Troy. But where the plant proliferates varies over time. It can be affected, it's a really tough perennial, but it can be affected by salinity, marine traffic, pollution. In the wintertime, sharp shards of ice can dig up its roots in the bed of the river. So taking measure of this wild celery is a way of taking measure of the aquatic health of the Hudson River. And protecting its beds from human activity is a way of safeguarding river ecology. But calculating its whereabouts presents practical problems. So every 5 years since 1987, scientists have arranged to have aerial photographs taken of the riverbeds. But the photography is really costly, and it's also not entirely dependable. The photos can capture the outline of the beds, but they can't capture the water clarity or the depth of the water. And sometimes glare will obscure the image. So, and the beds also vary in growth and density, and the aerial photographs can't get that either. So it's difficult for the scientists to know exactly what's going on beneath the surface of the river. So to find out more, they established a volunteer monitoring program in 2003. And so now every summer, these volunteers go out in their kayaks or canoes in pairs to actually go out and find these beds and measure them and give the data back. So it's a matter of taking inventory and tracking patterns in growth. So we go out equipped with these maps and looking for these transects and finding these coordinates, which I'll read about. And we go out with these handheld GPS units that help us to locate these coordinates. So I go out every summer with my friend Doug Reed and do this. And so when you're training for this SAV outing, subaquatic vegetation outing, they teach you how to use this Garmin unit, which is this, this GPS system that, they give you these waypoints, and then you have to go out and find them. So at these training exercises they do, when they kind of get us ready to go out on these expeditions, they make us go out in the parking lot. So they give you they give you these coordinates, and you go find where you are by the the spruce tree or the hemlock or the car or the sign or whatever it is. And you think you know what you're doing. You think, okay, right, I've got this, I can do it. And then a month later, you go out in your kayak and you're on the Hudson River, and you see how being out on water changes everything. So I'm just going to read a short section from the book about that. Low tide was just after 6 p.m., and because the wild celery is more visible in shallow water, our time frame was limited, only a couple of hours before and after that. When we set out a little before 5, it was still in the mid-80s, and the water like glass. We pushed off onto the shining concourse just as a constellation of gulls skittered across the mud flats to the south. To the north, the first great blue heron of the afternoon was poised motionless on a bed of water chestnuts. Doug had entered the coordinates for our waypoints into the GPS unit, and we paddled in the direction of our first transect, which meant finding the 3 or 4 or 5 assigned waypoints, then dropping in a small orange float at each to mark it. The invisible line these form marked the transect where we would check for vegetation. Yet it was just as Doug said. The computer lays out the transects in a straight line, but it's never as straight on the river. The manual for the project includes a 12-page appendix on how to use the Garmin, with instructions from downloading waypoints, putting them into text files, and then uploading these into the handheld units, all of which entails menu options, opening ports, auto-connects, and projection zones. At a training workshop earlier in the spring, I'd done my best with the unit to find arbitrary waypoints at assorted outdoor locations near the Institute's parking lot, under the spruce tree, over by the edge of the road. The frustrations of the afternoon were nothing compared to those experienced in trying to identify a waypoint on a moving river. Water changes everything. We'd learned as much at the training session. 75% of it is just getting there. Getting the data is only 25%, and I saw now what was meant. With the pull of the tide and the current, the faintest surface breeze, the inevitable drift of the canoe, or any of the other elusive factors that figure into the way a boat passes across water, the GPS coordinates were fugitive at best. Whatever happens out on water follows a less direct line. Research in the computer industry is aiming to make these devices more sensitive, and in a year or two, Doug may negotiate our transect along the river on a touch screen rather than by punching in numbers. Perhaps such a device that's more responsive to human gesture, touch, and intuition would make it easier to align our water path with the coordinates we've been assigned. A surface wind on the river was enough to remind me that how we know where we are and gauge our position is always an elusive exercise. Small wonder that the data sheets ask that we document both the expected and the actual locations. It's not just the coordinates, though, that are hard to pin down. The river world is always ambiguous, and for the proliferation of all the water weeds this time of year, for the acres of spatterdock spread out across the flats, and the wide beds of water chestnuts, the Stockport Flats are a curious place to take an inventory. The river here has been completely reconfigured, engineered, and re-engineered from dredging decades ago. Continually washed by 4-foot tides, the islands, flats, and marshes are the result of dredge spoils where the shallow water areas of the river were recontoured in the 19th and early 20th centuries to accommodate the large ships traveling up to Troy and Albany. Within only a few feet, the depth of the river here can change abruptly from 4 inches to over 30 feet, and out in the channel, it's deeper yet. But where we were laying out the transects, the river went from shallow to shallower and back again. The tide only added to the changeable boundaries of river and flats. One became the other quickly and constantly, and the contours of what was solid and what was fluid, what was water and what was ground, were continuously changing. Surely it was folly to imagine taking measure of such a place. By the second transect, then, we were out of our boats and waiting. The river was 4 inches deep here, too shallow to paddle, and Doug got out of his canoe and just pulled it along, waiting between the waypoints. For all the clarity of the water and brilliance of the afternoon light, trudging through the shallows along the meadow of mudflats and spatterdocks was a clumsy exercise. Along with the orange buoys we were equipped with was a Secchi disc, a black and white circular form that's lowered into the water on a string marked off with centimeter markings. Determining how deep the disc can be lowered into the water before it's no longer visible is a way to measure clarity which can be affected by sediment, precipitation, and wind stirring up the water. With no place for it to go, the disc stayed in my kayak. Several dark-shaded patches on the 2007 aerials had suggested the existence of the weed on this spot along the river. A vague triangle, a blurry linear strip, might indicate an area of growth. But the images were laid across one another, square over square, in an overlapping vertical arrangement that was oddly static and seemed to have little to do with the way the wide continuum of the river, seamless and ceaseless on a summer afternoon. Not for the first time, I wondered about the wisdom of trying to match up the natural world with such obscure digital images. Doug laid out the third transect, but still nothing. The data sheets offered a range of choices for the density of the beds: none, sparse, average, or dense, and I continued to write repeatedly, none, none, none. But none, I knew, is still data. 0 can be data too. I've heard this statement more than once, and it's a good lesson. when we don't see anything, or hear anything, or say anything, or think anything, when we have nothing to go on, that too is information. This seems to be a known fact that transcends the boundaries of discipline. In music, silence can be as resonant as sound. In mathematics, 0 can have the authority of a number. Robert Ryman's white canvases are a primer in the richness of white space. Merce Cunningham's choreography, an inquiry into stillness. Waiting for Godot, one of the most celebrated plays in the English language, is famously described as the play in which nothing happens. And in the words of abstract painter Ellsworth Kelly, the negative is just as important as the positive. Absence can be as powerful as presence. Not until the 5th transect did we finally spot the watery tendrils, and then, suddenly, they were everywhere. Where they brushed the surface of the water, they lie flat, combed by the current in an infinite variety of patterns, but beneath the surface their dense growth was even more apparent. Now as my kayak slipped across the water, it made a soft, rustling sound. We had found what we wanted, where we wanted it, and when, an alignment of desire, expectation, and discovery that I recognized to be an infrequent event. Wild celery puts its roots in the riverbed, but its leaves grow as slender ribbons, no more than a 1/4 inch wide, but up to 7 feet long. If the water is dark and visibility low, it's easy to miss them altogether, to paddle across a bed and never know they're there. Looking closely now, though, I could make out their empire of strands, a vast submerged spreadsheet of the river's health. The water had a different texture here. There was something in the exercise of locating transects, about calling out the location numbers, that seemed to be a way of assuring ourselves that there's an order to what's happening out here, a way perhaps to catalog and identify the unseen. But the ribbons drifted and flowed in whatever way the current combed them, marking out a different, more tenuous transect. By now I knew what ground truths were, and I could identify their equivalents out here on the river. Water truths by nature seemed to be transitory and elusive. In 1977, the artist Walter de Maria installed his work, The Lightning Field, in a remote desert of New Mexico. The piece consists of 400 rods of polished stainless steel embedded in the earth in a vast grid. Some 20 feet tall, the poles invite lightning during storms, but most visitors are said to find the arrangement of rods just as compelling on clear days. Perhaps it's enough to witness the possibility of having these poles connect the wide desert sky with the red earth. Now I imagined that this subaquatic meadow was some remote corollary to de Maria's field, and that these fluid tendrils existed in some parallel universe to his steel rods, some alternative connection not above ground but beneath, water, vegetable rather than mineral, drifting randomly rather than on a grid. And for the next hour we found ourselves navigating the shallows, at times noting abundant and dense beds where only a few feet away there was nothing. The categories offered by the data sheets are accompanied by drawings and corresponding percentages. None, 0 to 10%, sparse, 10 to 15, average, 25 to 50, abundant, over 50. And I recognize now that the word data is derived from the Latin word to give. There can be something mesmerizing about taking these measurements, and I knew then that it was not simply about taking measure, but about how we take measure. And I was reminded of all the different ways we have of counting, some abstract, theoretical, remote, others like this, a direct, immediate physical act. Our choices seem to have grown. I gauge books and pages unless I'm reading on a Kindle, in which case I'm compelled to think in percentages. And then there are those calculations that have no limits. My friend Romig, a potter, has an order from Korea for ceramic tableware, hundreds upon hundreds of plates, cups, and bowls that she tells me she'll be unable to fulfill in her lifetime. And my friend Myron has a different lesson plan in the immeasurable. A gardener, he's recently taken to planting saffron crocuses. The small lavender flower blooms for several weeks in the fall, at which point he takes delight in using the word harvest to describe the process of pinching out 3 spiky red stigmas produced by each flower with his fingers, or sometimes a pair of tweezers. He dries the small threads on a piece of paper, then stores them in a dark place. When he offered to show me his crop, I saw 6 strands on a small sheet of paper. Beneath it was another sheet of paper with 3 strands. 5,400 flowers will be required to produce the 16,000 strands needed for a single ounce of saffron. How many October afternoons would this take, I wondered. Jorge Luis Borges once noted that it was inconvenient to deal in inconceivable numbers, but convenience is relative, and all Myron said is that he'd invite me over for a bowl of paella when he had enough threads to flavor a pan of rice. Since 2003, volunteers have collected 1,200 data points. By the end of the day, Doug and I will have added only 25 or 30 more. How many will be needed? Maybe in the 21st century, the collective effort to compile a comprehensive data set is the equivalent to those labors made by previous generations to build pyramids and cathedrals, stone by stone, beam by beam. Perhaps all of these fall into that category of enterprise alluded to by the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr when he observed, "Nothing that's worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope." But the thought, a bit grandiose for an afternoon out on the river, fled as quickly as it came. And besides, the way we were taking measure, had a texture and light and current of its own. Maybe, too, it had to do with the simple repetition, the ritual of doing the same thing over and over and over again, though the results are always different. Months later, after the data has been compiled and analyzed, they'll be added to the 346 data points gathered from 15 other sites. Data collection by volunteers in 2007 and 2008 had indicated a diminishment of growth, but the plant now seems to have rebounded and the inventory gained efficiency. The New York State DEC will use the information as it evaluates permits for waterfront construction, but beds of subaquatic vegetation have already figured into land use policy when developers of a marina project in nearby Troy were denied a permit based on the weed's robust presence. The data sheets also point to a connection between areas of the river with subaquatic vegetation loss and banks that have been reinforced with hard engineering using materials such as steel and concrete. The information will be of value as communities up and down the river reevaluate how to modify shorelines as necessitated by climate change and rising waters. Tonight, though, identifying what was happening out here includes a more varied set of calculations. Along with the waypoints, the transects, the readings for depth and clarity, and the estimations of density, there was the arc of the snowy egret's sudden lift, the changing slant of afternoon light, the rate at which the trees were taking on shadows, and all the other factors of order on an August evening. A great blue heron standing on the flats captured the shade of evening and was bluer than ever, almost indigo, but its beak caught the last of the light as the sun slipped away. How little of the information that surrounds us is quantifiable, and I wondered then if what we had on our hands was an extravagance of coordinates. The thought vanished almost as quickly as it came, and we headed upstream. Thank you.
Amazing, right? Wow. Very difficult to know where to start, but I will plunge on in. Haha. Sorry. What struck me actually was when you were talking about when you swam across the river, and that book began with a swim and not with the idea of writing the book, but with I think you talked about it as the experience and texture of the water. But I guess in other books you've begun with the idea of the book and then gone out to collect the data, the research. And I wonder if you could just talk about the qualitative differences in those experiences of researching and writing. The way the passage you've just read reads, as if you were there taking notes as you're going along. But I wonder how that was actually produced.
I think actually all of the books, none of them actually began, is this on? Does it matter? Anyway, none of them really began as, oh, here's an idea for a book. Geography of Home began as a series of articles because I just wanted to kind of go through this old house we lived in kind of room by room and just sort of see where that took me. And, soon enough it sort of seemed to, there is a progression here and it does make sense to turn this into a book. But I think, and I like to talk to my students about this, for me, the books have just come out of some kind of experience where I discovered something, and that's not necessarily enough. I mean, the Rivers book and this book, it wasn't just personal experience. It was when that experience connects to something bigger. Otherwise, it would just be memoir, which is fine. But I didn't think, in terms of what I was doing, it was that interesting. It was when these experiences really connect you to, a larger, greater fields of interest. That, to me, is when, then it becomes interesting to kind of turn it into something. So in different books, I kind of realized that there was a book there kind of at different points, and maybe that's what you're asking is how does that change? I mean, I think by the time I was out on the river with Doug, I knew that, what I was finding did have kind of greater relevance. So I knew at that point I was working on a book. But but certainly when I was running up in the woods behind that poor guy looking for the bat, I mean there was just it was just a way of paying attention. And I guess all of these books just kind of begin in a way of just sort of trying to pay attention to a single thing and seeing where that takes you. And I know there have been other projects, they're not coming to mind at the moment, but where you're paying attention to something and a book doesn't come out of it. So.
Yeah, I've done that. I'm just going to do a few more questions and then we'll open up to the audience because selfishly I want to bring the discussion around criticism. And you have this very interesting conception of design as being, you could understand design as being about the notion of fit, in terms of fit. And it struck me that actually as critics, we're all about not fitting, aren't we? We're sort of, in some ways, our work is to somehow stick out or go against the grain or pick out what is unfit, in the design world. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your own views on the role of criticism, of design criticism, and sort of how it can be performed. It doesn't. You may not agree with mine.
That's a really difficult question. I'm not sure I can really answer that. I think what I try to do with the students in my class is just to have them approach it from, to sort of approach this idea of fit from a really personal level, from personal experience, from what they see, what they experience, and then connect that to something larger. And in terms of not fitting, that's the interesting thing about fit, right, is what doesn't fit. And, if something doesn't fit, is that for a good reason? So I think those, that kind of question comes into it all the time. But is that close to what you're talking about? What role the critic has. That's a big question. I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but I think if you bring to it something really genuine in your experience, in your human experience, then you're bringing a kind of level of humanity to it that I think is essential to the critic's role. So I guess.
That's like a good goal for all of us. And then also I wanted to ask you about this concept of measurement, which is just fascinating. And, you're already doing a lot of kind of transplanting back and forth of these metaphors and concepts from science to design. But I wonder if you can sort of push that one a little bit further on, how may we measure design?
Yeah, I was, there was a, sorry, I have to single you out, Catherine. Catherine was a student last year who wrote a beautiful essay about measuring an empty building. This building was being completely gutted, and the office she was working for, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, had asked her to go in and measure every window, every wall, the distance, from every outlet. I mean, just measuring, and I just, there was this, she'd written this beautiful essay about measuring this empty building, and she sorry to embarrass you, but she did it with such a light hand where, it was kind of this, it almost came out, so it was this kind of Zen exercise of measuring emptiness. And it kind of brought to mind how, this is something we're always doing. I mean, I just think it's human, it's intuitive. We're always trying to take measure of the world around us because it kind of, I think, verifies our place in the physical world. And it's just something that I think comes to us naturally. So I think as design writers, it's really interesting to look at this and see how you do it and under what circumstances and how that impulse and intuition kind of makes itself manifest in your everyday life.
But I think it's actually, you obviously do it, and Catherine does it, but I think the problem with much criticism is that they don't, and it's done from a distance, and that the actual hands-on, what was it called, ground truth? Yeah. The work of discovering ground truth doesn't go on, and this is something we're trying to rectify with teaching reporting and so forth, but that sounds like a good example. Let's take some questions from the first year. You haven't met the first year students yet, have you? Yeah.
I've met a couple of them earlier.
So I'll help you identify them, and then we'll open up to the general audience. So, come on then. This is Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan.
Yeah.
We've been learning about different approaches to writing this semester, interviewing and hard news reporting, reviewing exhibitions, and also writing essays. What you've been talking about really is more about interpreting it as a personal narrative. How do you feel that approach fits into design criticism?
Well, it does and it doesn't. I think what I try to ask my students to do in reading design is we work on research-based personal essays. So, I mean, some of the essays are really, what I want you to do is bring personal experience, into what you're thinking about, writing about. But as we advance, I really ask you to fold in research. So you're bringing both your own, personal experience in with research, whether, it's a building or environment or, whatever it is, that you connect your experience with something, that goes beyond that.
Hi, Mary. You mentioned that through your research you saw how things could complement and inform each other, but that sometimes they could also contradict. Could you kind of elaborate on what you mean by the contradictions and how you take those contradictions?
Oh, yeah. Well, that just came from the time when we were out. It was we were looking for vernal pools, and we had these maps that had been drawn from from aerial photographs, and it was indicated with a little cross hatching. And so we spent 45 minutes kind of going back and forth looking for this, looking for what this remote sensor had told us was there, which in fact was not there. So how that appeared, on our map, I have no idea, but there was no water there. So, it's this, what I was saying about, we're always not just, scientists out in the field, but all of us are called on to reconcile this, this information that comes from really different areas. And usually you hope that, the two kinds of knowledge sustain each other, but sometimes some of it's wrong. And it's good to be reminded of that. It was a good exercise to be out there looking for something that's not there, that, time-honored human enterprise. So.
You were talking about accuracy and observation. I was wondering what does it mean to you observe as a writer?
I am so bad at paying attention. And I just, if there's anything that I try to do working on this book, it's just like learn how to pay attention more. I mean, somewhere I talk about this moment in the book when I was working on these essays, and I really thought I was getting good at, I thought I was getting better. And our house got broken into, and I came in, I had run out to do some errands, and I came in, and there were these burglars there, and they left. It was all fine. They didn't take anything. They left all of that, and the police came, and they said, "What did you see?" And I could barely remember a single thing. They said, "Well, can you describe the car?" And I said, "Oh yeah, of course. It was gray." Useless. I was just a totally useless witness. So I guess what I'm talking about is just, we all as writers and just as human beings, we try to be good witnesses. I mean, every day I try to be a better witness, and it's hard. So.
Actually, before we open up, I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about some of the writers that you find inspiring. I mean, there's obviously the ones that you guide the students through, but in terms of that sort of accuracy and observation.
Oh, one of the books that I've asked students to read in the last couple of years is The Hare with the Amber Eyes, because that's aside from the way, the entire book sort of hinges, or, pivots around objects, which I think was interesting. It's Edmund Duval. He tells a very personal family history, but he's also talking about world history, European history of the last 150 years, and he weaves together these two different stories in a really kind of seamless, extraordinarily eloquent narrative, I think. So that's one. And then I always, we also have a section on poetry, and this year I'm bringing Frank O'Hara into it, because there's something about the kind of distillation of poetry that I think is always a really, just makes for really useful reading. Distillation probably isn't quite the right word, but there's something about the process of really crystallizing a thought, and then also the kind of associative process that poetry engages. I think both of those things. So, yeah.
All right, let's take some questions from the back. Do you want to start?
So I would say that your life is actually defined by accuracy, observation. So it's interesting that you're a terrible witness at times, because it strikes me that, if we think about art or music or poetry, some of the best of that almost seems to always start from observation. That is, they see something that the rest of us miss. And that's how I feel like you're writing. So I was just wondering, when you were asked earlier, how does it start? Does it start writing? Does it start with an idea? Does it start with an observation? To me, you're just this incredible antenna that catches everything that goes by. And so I wonder if you think there's any truth to that idea that observation comes first, whether it's art or poetry, and that somehow what we all need to do to train ourselves is to train ourselves to be more observant, to be more attentive. I guess your book about paying attention, slowing down in a time of rapid change and so on, is part of the struggle that we face, but we're so rushed in the world today. I don't know if that's a question.
I guess that so much of what I was maybe reading today was about sort of this intuitive, this kind of impulse and intuition to take measure and things like that. But I think to really be attentive and really be observant is not intuitive. It doesn't. I think most of us, well, certainly speaking for myself, it doesn't come naturally. And I think that's where I'd like to get, is just where that kind of attentiveness and observation is just something you do naturally. And I find that for most of us, that kind of natural attentiveness is pretty difficult. So I don't know if that's.
So what's the solution?
Not there yet, don't know. Yeah.
I actually have a question following on a lack of solutions. I think something that's really interesting with dealing with scientific research in your work is that and the expert status, there's a sort of a need to have a point of view. And something I really like about your work is you're comfortable with open-ended questions.
Oh yeah, I've had this conversation with writers a lot. When I don't know if this is really speaking to what you're asking, but often when you're writing a piece, I don't know where it's going to go. I mean, I have no idea where it's going to go, and I think sometimes that's fine. I mean, sometimes you're really writing to make a point, and you have a clear conclusion, and you're going from A to B to C, and you know where you're going. But I think often there's something in the actual, almost the physical process of writing where the ideas get teased out as you're writing, and you may not know where you're going. And I think any writer you talk to, I'm sure you've had that experience where, the ideas come as you're writing, and maybe you end up at a completely different place. So, I think that's, if you're a critic, I think that's challenging because you find, what you think you're saying really changes. But just back to having a point of view and, and working with, as you say, the experts. A lot of times, when I was talking to scientists, in these projects, it kind of took me back, 30 or 30, I don't even know how many years ago, when I started to write about architecture. And that was in the late 70s and early 80s, and there was a lot of theory then. I mean, that's a lot of what was happening was, this really arcane, difficult theory, and I didn't have that background. And it was like, could you use language that I can understand? And, like, how am I going to understand what this person's saying? And, I think this time around, scientists have a real problem, often, not always, but often, putting their ideas out there in a way that the rest of us can understand. And, especially right now when it's so important to know what kind of work they're doing, it's really vital. So this time around, I was a little less fearful about saying, can you say that in a way that that's clear to me? And so, I just think that's something, you just kind of learn, you learn to do. And then the point of view, well, that just comes. So.
A couple weeks ago, I went to a talk at the Natural History Museum, given by this woman, Patricia Wright, who started out as a social worker, and before a rock concert in the late 60s, she went to a pet shop with some friends and bought a monkey, and became obsessed with caring for the monkey, and wanted to find a mate for it. So she took a month off of work and went down to Amazon to try and find a mate. And this turned into like her scientific obsession. And like along the way, gathered enough data to get funded, even though she had no degree. So anyway, I'm wondering if...
Thank you. That is a wonderful story. I don't know what I can say to that, except that it's really great.
Well, the parallel there is you're on a journey, and I'm wondering if you're at the point where is citizen science enough? Do you want to lead your own research, or do you see yourself moving in that direction, like more focused?
Yeah, I wish. I mean, that's actually that's a really great question. God, maybe that takes us back to to being attentive enough. I'm just, when I see what those scientists do and when I see the way they think. I mean, you're talking to someone who got out of biology in 9th grade by saying, I don't believe in dissecting frogs, and they let me get away with it, and that was the last science course I took. So, I'm not sure I could ever, take on any kind of research with quite that kind of, detail that you're talking about. But that's a wonderful story. So, yeah.
I have a story to contribute that's a little more sedate than what you just described, in the way of being observant. I was with my family on vacation in Arizona with my husband and young children, and I decided I wanted to take a picture of something, and so they gave me instructions in getting out of the car to be quick about it, because they were going to sit in the car. And so I figured, okay, I'm going to take a picture of a building or whatever, and I thought they might be a little cranky when I got back, like, why didn't you take so long, even if it was just a tiny amount of time. But they were actually quite excited when I got back to the car, and that surprised me. And what had happened while they were just sitting stationary is that they had the opportunity to take a glance at the tree that the car was next to, and it turned out that there were lines on the tree, and only because they were stationary and had the time to be observant that they discovered the lines were there. And who knows how many lines we had passed previously driving around and didn't even see them.
Right. Slow down.
Stop the car.
Right. Get out of the car.
Well, actually, we have, I think, another antidote to hurrying sickness for you in the other room, which is some wine and cheese, which we invite you to join us and continue a nice leisurely conversation with Akiko from my wine cover. But before we do that, please join me in thanking once again the amazing